Hi, my name's Phil. I like talking about politics, and in this video I'd like to discuss the low levels of public awareness concerning the various crises in the UK, but right now most particularly COVID, that may be propping the Conservatives up in the polls, but also to discuss the notion that this might be entirely deliberate for the purposes of generating support for an election very soon. But first, if you'd like to be notified of daily news and politics, please subscribe to the channel and click the bell notification icon. So about a month ago, Labour had just overtaken the Conservatives in the polls again for the first time since the start of the year. Hurrah! It didn't last long, did it? And the ruling party bounced back up and have been fairly stable at 39% since. But why? Well, if you think about all the things that have happened in that time, it's absolutely maddening, isn't it? Crisis after crisis after crisis. But at the weekend, I looked at some data regarding COVID cases and deaths, because that's a fairly serious crisis going on right now. And I compared our figures with other countries around Europe. The UK, in terms of average number of new cases per day per 100,000 of the population, for the UK it's 53.4 at the time I'm doing this. 53, or at the weekend, sorry, 53.4. For Germany, 11.7. France 6.2, Italy 4.6, Spain 3.3. But if you were to tell the average member of the public that, they'd be surprised. They wouldn't go, oh yeah, we knew that. No, they have no idea. In fact, they'd have no idea it was so high for us compared to others. Then you compare where we are now with where we were a year ago. At the time of recording this, the UK has an average of 36,500 new cases per day. On the same day last year, it was 13.7 thousand. The number of new cases per day is nearly treble the rate that it was a year ago. And remember that a year ago, Boris Johnson at this point was resisting calls for a new lockdown against the strongest scientific advice. But we have vaccines now, you may say. Okay, although we might have treble the number of cases, people aren't dying from it as much, are they, Phil? Oh, really? We have an average of 112 people dying a day from COVID right now in the UK. A year ago, it was 63. So sure, vaccines are helping. Of course, our rate of death is not treble what it was last year, like cases, but it's double. It's still double the number of deaths we were having last year without vaccines. Again, how many of the general public do you think are aware of this? These figures are not being presented with any emphasis in the media. The government have fewer mitigations in place than last year, and it shows. We also have a variant that is sweeping through young people much more easily than what we were dealing with last year. Our death rate, the metric that is of most interest to the public, is absolutely desperate. They don't know about it. But people are, they're not seeing these reports. They think that the vaccine has done its job. Not that we have vaccinated enough of the population. Our rate of vaccination is now very poor. It's one of the worst in Europe. People seem to be behaving as if the job is essentially done. After all, why else would the government have told us we don't need face masks anymore? Or that we don't have to isolate from contact? We're also now expecting a huge surge in flu cases this winter with our lack of mitigations, along with COVID, of course. How much of an optimist do you have to be to think that the hospitals won't melt down again this winter? Even Boris Johnson's mindless brand of optimism can't drown out the fact that he is inflicting upon us within the next few months an absolute crisis in the NHS again. Bear in mind that our NHS was melting in winter even before the pandemic. Of course, back in 2019, you couldn't just order a lockdown, so the patients just had to be dumped on the floor in corridors, and that was exactly what was happening. Now there's a ready excuse. So is Boris Johnson deliberately stoking the conditions to trigger another lockdown? Well, let's look at the political pros and cons. Against this is the notion that too many in the Conservative Party do not want any more lockdowns and have given the impression they'd flip their lids if the government ordered another. You could absolutely interpret the government's lack of mitigations as Conservative MPs just don't like them and Boris Johnson just couldn't put them in place. That being said, if the hospitals were actually shutting their doors to new admissions across the country, the public would be screaming for it. With hospitals incapacitated, the death toll would soar. Not just from COVID, not even just from flu either, but everything that the NHS would normally be treating successfully. A government presiding over a rising death toll that the public was suddenly made aware of and doing nothing to act against it when everyone knows there's something it can do will not remain the government for very long. So this could force the majority of Conservative MPs to back another lockdown. But would Boris Johnson really want that? So we know that Johnson is not himself in favour of lockdowns. It's not just that it's not like with Matt Hancock's case where he sort of knew we needed the lockdowns and he was fighting against the tide of his own party. With Boris Johnson, he is also on the side of people that don't really like lockdowns. You know, he is a libertarian as well. And he's appointed a very anti-lockdown health minister in Sajid Javid, who has not been in favour of any of the lockdowns we've had. So one thing is for certain, if we needed a lockdown again, we wouldn't be getting one until well after it would do the most good. But I cannot get over just how clearly we are coping much worse than a year ago, despite the vaccination programme. It just shows what the experts have said all along. You cannot just rely upon the vaccines. You need the mitigations to go alongside it. We've abandoned all the mitigations in England. Parts of the UK, they're still in place, or some are still in place. In England, not really. And note that we ended up with 2 lockdowns. You know, if we go back to a year ago, since then we had 2 lockdowns, one of which lasted almost half a year in some form or other. So there must be political advantage. Johnson and his government are largely ideologically opposed to pandemic measures, so there must be some use from it. Now that use could be easing the damage caused by Brexit, because that's causing them headaches at the moment. You know, the moment they're getting away with denying the Brexit links. And I am going to be discussing the prospect of gathering public support for the Conservatives with an eye on a general election tomorrow related to something else. And that election may well be coming very soon. But I also see the COVID situation potentially being stoked for this purpose as well. Essentially, the government have the following political problem. The consequences of Brexit are hitting very hard. Some of the consequences were entirely predicted years ago. Some of them have been made worse by the pandemic. We weren't expecting the pandemic. Some crises, which would not have been predicted at all, like the gas shortage, have been made worse by Brexit. You know, so both Brexit and non-Brexit crises have all stacked on top of each other to make a right old mess. And although the Conservatives are convincing people right now that it's not Brexit, that other countries have the same problems, which is a lie, they don't. The thing is that these crises are not actually going to go away. In fact, because they are causing these critical shortages, you know, with their own Brexit mindset, the crises are set to get worse. Government strategists at Party HQ know this. They've known it for a while. This is why they spent summer getting themselves ready with candidate selection procedures in order to be able to trigger a general election as soon as they spied that the conditions were right for it. They're ready to go this year. They could go this year. They could go for November, December general election. You know, though the chances of that are less. You know, the reason they've done this is they know the situation isn't going to improve. The government are talking about, oh yeah, short term. They know it's not short term. The government may be fooling people into thinking that this is just a bad time now and we'll get over it. But what about in a year's time? When the cost of living is rising out of control, shortages are becoming a fact of life, not a short-term transition. What then? Conservative strategists worry that the longer they leave the next election, the more likely they will be to lose the confidence of the public. Yes, at the moment, Boris Johnson is really good at gaslighting the public, but surely there are limits. You know, even though the Conservatives are leading in the polls, it's not enough to be confident of retaining their majority in Parliament. If they did trigger a general election now, there is a chance that they could lose their majority. So they're stuck between a rock and a hard place. The longer they leave the election, the greater the risk of having no chance at all. If you have it sooner, they could still lose the majority because they're not in a great place right now and therefore still lose their power. They may be trapped. So maybe they feel they can't afford to go to the polls right now, but maybe next summer. You know, but what if the situation is even worse next summer? Worse still, what if Labour start to improve their strategy and start making inroads into public opinion? They can't risk that either. So what if there were another lockdown? Unpopular in some quarters, but if we're honest, let's face facts, most of the people that would not like that generally are Tory voters who will still vote Tory. But the political benefits of another lockdown would be, one, more people working at home again. That puts less demand on things like petrol supplies, maybe even energy as well. Secondly, with hospitality closing down again, less demand for the distribution of food and drink. So that can focus more on supermarkets, start to ease the shortages there. Third, opposition MPs would be prevented from getting out and about talking to the public as freely as they do. So the government would control the messages to the public more easily again, just as in previous lockdowns. Four, the government would get to blame problems on the pandemic again, all of these things, you know, and people would go, oh yeah, because we're in lockdown again, the pandemic must have just flared up again. Yeah. Something that just continues to be a gift for them. Because nobody seriously blames the government for the fact that we have the pandemic, but they too frequently never even question if the government are actually getting their strategy right on it. They just keep accepting that the government are doing as well as anyone else could. And this could ease the situation, provide a useful distraction to let them shore up public support again. If nothing else, even if it doesn't do it over the lockdown, they'll get a boost in the polls as they start to end the lockdown, just like they did earlier this year. No one turned around and said, but the reason we're in lockdown is because of the government. They just went, oh, hooray for the government, we're coming out of lockdown. And then they can trigger the general election for May or June. Now, I'm not saying I think this is the strategy. You know, there would absolutely be a lot of resistance to this sort of action, not least from the Chancellor Rishi Sunak, as well as some very noisy backbenchers. But Johnson is only focused on his own power trip, and if he is convinced by his strategists that this will help him extend his power, I've no doubt he would do it. That being said, there is another potential way in which he could drum up support as well, which I will be discussing, as I said, tomorrow. But until then, those are my thoughts. Let me know yours in the comments below. Hope you found the video interesting. If you did, don't forget to click the like button. If you'd like to support the channel further, please also click the Patreon link for details. And until next time, I'll see you later.